We can be free to say what we want.
So
Oh,
I'm
there
gonna
it is.
record it, I'm gonna record it to my computer and I'll see if I can switch it around.
Oh, is that the new and improved Y-Guard?
I, good
Wired,
question.
no, you mean wired. It is not what, it's wired.
I
No,
think
what's nothing to do with that. at all.
No, I think we're all here. So let us begin with the blessing and we'll study Torah together. Baruch
Good
atah
Adonai, Eloheinu melech
Haolam.
Asher
asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah.
Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the world.
Who have sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to engage in the words of Torah.
Amen. All right, Rabbi, I think we're on page 99.
99, and we're going to hit page 100 just momentarily. So, Boker Tov to everyone and good morning.
Good
How are you
morning.
doing?
Good afternoon. Afternoon to Shirley.
1 o'clock here.
Oh, yes. Well,
Oh, right.
and Bernie, what time is it at your place?
Noon. Is an hour difference.
So you're on mountain time,
Yep.
and we're on Pacific, basically.
Wow.
Okay.
So you're later than us as well. So,
We're on Central
Bernie's
Time.
entering afternoon and
We
Shirley's
got them all
already
covered here.
So good morning, everyone. We're entering the book of Leviticus, the third of the fifth books. And as Steve already said, we are talking about the meaning of sacrifice, sacrifices in the temple. And this is a big topic. I am planning to give a fairly major sermon on it. I was going to do it this week, but I may do it next week because this week I kind of feel I have to talk about the judicial reform controversies that are going on in Israel. They're talking about civil war there. It's unprecedented antagonism. And, we don't talk about partisan politics, but this is an issue in Israel that affects everybody. So, so this sermon would be for not this Friday, but for next Friday. But this is also important. My favorite philosopher, Maimonides, made a very contradictory statements in his two major books. And I think I've told you about, Maimonides and his positions on contradicting himself. Basically, he said this is a good thing. He deliberately contradicts himself, and that if you're smart like Bernie or Evelyn, you'll be able to figure out what the contradiction really means. That underneath it all, he's really trying to say something, but he doesn't want to be too clear. So sacrifices are obviously an important part of this because on one hand, sacrifices are a central part of the biblical system. On the other hand, even in Maimonides' day, and probably even before then, people realized that this was probably not the way that Judaism was structured. So, and I let's see if I I refer you again to the book that I'm reading, God and Anatomy, in which the author talks about how the Bible sees God very much as a God that has a body, has feet, has head, genitals, everything. So this is not the way that later Judaism saw God. And so, they have sacrifices where God is smelling the delicious smell of the sacrifices. This made sense to the biblical authors because God had a nose. He had a big nose, much bigger than ours, with much more sensitive smelling capacity, but God had a nose, and therefore if we made a barbecue for him, he'd like the smell. That was a good thing. In later Judaism, where God is incorporeal, it's not only not a good thing, it seems like sacrilege. So that's kind of the basic conundrum that we face. Brief comments or opening statements, or anyone wanna to perhaps contradict anything that I'd said. Lorraine?
Find
We
this
don't hear you.
whole, can you hear me now? Yeah. I
Yes.
find this whole sacrifice thing distasteful and annoying. And did they really do this in that day?
Yeah, for hundreds of years. And
Yeah.
so you agree with Maimonides that we want to eliminate it, and we want, it was something maybe necessary for the times, but not something that we advanced people would want to engage in.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right,
Marcia, and then
Yeah.
Evelyn.
yeah,
So what I'm thinking is, aside from how cruel and all that it sounds, the sacrifice itself, it seems that when you're sacrificing, what you're giving up is something of value, something monetary, or something that you would have used yourself. It isn't giving from the heart. It's a more a superficial giving, and that's what I don't like about it. Aside for the humanitarian, humane purposes of it, so to say, but the fact that the giving is your pocketbook giving, which is hard for a lot of people, and in that community at that time it was hard. But to me, the prayer part of it is more meaningful. Okay.
But remember, there's a lot of people in Israel today who are just dying to reestablish animal sacrifice in the temple.
Really? Really?
Absolutely. There's a whole yeshiva they created like 30 years ago to study the law, called the Torah to Kohanim. It's primarily for Kohanim. And the goal is to prepare the Kohanim to resume temple worship. Now, of course, the only problem, which is a big problem, is that there are 2 mosques up there. And they understand that trying to move those mosques without the Muslims' permission would start a third world war. But if there were no mosques up there, they would have who would have stopped them? If there was no mosque up there, they would have, after 1967, the Orthodox would have started building a third temple up there, and you'd have animal sacrifices every day. And there'd be half the country that would say, just like with the judicial reform, half the country would say this is wonderful, and half the country would ignore it. And you would be in the midst of it. So maybe the Muslims did us a favor in a certain sense, but there's a lot of people that's the halacha in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, where he's summarizing the laws of the Talmud. He includes the laws for the temple and for the animal sacrifice. In his Guide to the Perplexed, he says the stuff that Lorraine is saying, but that was written in Arabic. The Mishnah Torah is written in Hebrew. So Maimonides was talking to 2 different audiences, and he said 2 different things. So, but if the Muslims agreed to move the mosques, should we take up a donation to help rebuild the temple?
Mashiach will come first.
Well, that's exactly, it's connected.
For the sole reason of sacrifice?
Well, it's connected to the coming of the Messiah, and Evelyn points out a good point, is that there might be all ultra-Orthodox Jews who say it's sacrilegious to rebuild the temple of God until God tells you to do it, and the way God would tell you to do it would be by sending a Messiah.
There are those in Israel today that believe that the temple can be built up there, without moving the mosques, that there's room where it was built
Oh.
before and
Oh,
without moving the mosques.
okay.
Yeah.
So you could build part of the temple between the mosques and.
No, 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 no.
All right, Evelyn, comment.
Apropos what Marcia said, the business of sacrifice, I assume, was to expiate sin, or the feeling of sin, and which was carried on through Catholicism. So if you go to the priest and he absolves you, that's fine. If you sacrifice at the altar, I presume its purpose was to absolve yourself of whatever sins you committed. And of course, to us, the sacrifice concept of sacrifice itself is so abhorrent to our current culture and way of thinking. And as you point out, of course, this was common practice. But my feelings are people will sacrifice and consider themselves absolved of sin and go ahead and sin again. And so it is a never-ending process and unrealistic in terms of human behavior. The sacrifice itself does not improve human behavior, which is what my feelings are. The Torah implies that we should do. So the concept of sacrifice to me is repugnant, as it is to Lorraine, and it's an ancient concept that I think has left us. Our instead of sacrifice, do we consider ourselves being well? Let me put it this way: when we give up so much for our children, for our community, is that considered a sacrifice as well? Perhaps I'm mixing up two different concepts.
Well, yes, and there are two different concepts which, as a Reform rabbi, I would deliberately mix up. So I would then take the idea of the korbanot, the actual animal sacrifices, and I would morph it into this new idea that Evelyn's talking about of sacrifice as a metaphor. So, if you give up, you give your favorite car to your granddaughter, that's a sacrifice. But Marcia's not convinced. But in the literal meaning, the korbanot were actual animal or other sacrifices. I do want to point out that there were different types of sacrifices. Not all of them were there to obviate a sin. There was a peace offering. There was other holiday offerings. There were several types of sacrifices. Bernie.
My sense is that a lot of the sacrifice was preemptive rather than redemptive. And that people were giving these sacrifices so something bad wouldn't happen.
Exactly, and that's why the sacrifices. This is one of my concepts. This is an original thought that I differentiate between the ideas of ceremony and ritual. Remember me talking about that? Ritual is something that has to be done in a very specific way. So a sacrifice is a ritual. If you deviate, then God is going to be unhappy or even angry. A ceremony is something we as Reform Jews do, which is designed to make us feel connected. And so a ceremony can be done in any way that works for the people. So if Babette says, I don't understand the Hebrew, I can translate it into English. If Babette says, don't make it too long, I can shorten it. If Babette says, make it longer, I can make it longer. But you can't do that in a ritual. A ritual.
I'm not a fetch.
But if Babette says to me in the sacrifice in the temple, be nice to the cow, and I do something different, then God will say that's not the rules. So So you have to do it exactly as planned. Any other opening comments before we start the text? Pam or
Yes.
Rita?
Why should God get angry at what people do?
I gotta follow Steve here. Evelyn, you gotta raise your hand and wait.
Okay.
Otherwise, Steve is gonna send me an aggressive email, and he's gonna threaten me with all sorts of punitive things, and I'll say, but I'll offer a sacrifice. Raise your hands, please. If there's any, Pam, Riva, B. Okay, Evelyn.
No, you're mentioning that God will get angry if you deviate from a proscribed ritual. Why should we attribute the emotion of anger to God? Yes, according to the Bible, yes, God did become angry, and yet as the concept of him has changed over the millennia,
Right.
we are attributing human traits to the supreme being, and this supreme being should be far superior to humans, in my concept at any rate. And therefore, if God shows anger, there's too much of a human trait in him, and I find him less godlike as a result.
So the question is, which God are we talking about?
That's right.
But the God of the Bible, at least as portrayed in the book I'm reading, has feet, wears shoes, goes traveling.
And is male.
He's very male, there's no question. He's not, like later Maimonides says, God is, just a philosophic concept. God is not male or female, but that's Maimonides. But the Bible says God is a man, and a very macho man. And God gets angry, very angry. And God demands that we do what he tells us to do, or else. And if not, he might huff and puff and blow your house in. I mean, literally. So it depends what God you're talking about. So I'm just the messenger. I heard that both the Russian and the Chinese leaders don't like advisors who tell them the truth, and so they were saying that nobody will tell them the truth because they might get thrown into prison or worse. So don't throw me into prison, but that's the story. All right, page 99. Let's start. You'll see that Harvey Fields conflates things, partly deliberately, perhaps. And we're going to try to not conflate them, but let's go. Who'd like to read the first part? Bernie, are you up to that? No? You need better glasses. Pam, you are up to it.
Yes.
Okay.
The meanings of sacrifice and prayer. The third book of the Torah is named in Hebrew by the first word, the Vayikra, and God called. In Latin, the book is called Leviticus because the priests whose duties described were of the tribe Levi. By the 1st century CE, it was known among the early rabbis as Torah Kohanim, instruction of the priests.
Okay, so Torah to Kohanim, Ha is just the, so Kohanim is plural for Kohen.
Yep.
As you know, I'm a Kohen. Do we have any other Kohens here? Oh, wow, see. And Yasminya?
It's not passed through to women because my father was.
This is a very interesting question because in Jamaica, the issue came up because they wanted to preserve the historic Jamaican custom of calling for the first Aliyah a Kohen, calling for the second Aliyah a Levi, and calling for the third and subsequent Aliyot Israel's. But they were giving equal rights to women. So they asked me how to do this. So I wrote a question to the responsive committee at the CCAR, and they wrote a long message back. It took them a few months to study it. And they said, that in Reform Judaism, we normally don't attribute special religious significance to a status that you inherit. And I inherited being a Kohen. I worked to become a rabbi, right? I went to school for many years. I did nothing to become a Kohen. My father one day said, oh, by the way, my father told me that I'm a Kohen and therefore you're a Kohen. And that was it. I was a Kohen. So, but they said, if you wanted to develop your own system of incorporating Kohen and Levite with an egalitarian structure, you could do it. But the reform movement's not going to do it, among other reasons, because of the reason I just gave, that it is, giving a rank to people just because of the status of birth, but also because it's impossible. You'd have to go back. So a woman who's not a Kohen, like Lorraine, she could trace back. Did any of her ancestors, were they Kohen? Now, let's say you go back 6 generations and your great, 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 great grandmother's father was a Kohen. Now, your great, 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 great ancestor would not have been a Kohen because it doesn't go through the female line. But if we're retroactively putting it through the female line, we have to go back. And anyone who had it anywhere in the male or female line could then declare themselves a Kohen. Riva looks happy because she's now going to be able to be a Kohen, a Kohenet, or whatever the word would be. But it is definitely, too complicated, and most people won't know. So effectively, everybody would become a Kohen overnight, and that it would create havoc. So they said, if you want to do it down there in Jamaica, feel free. But we're not doing it for the whole reform movement. So don't ask us to get involved. So
what did you do?
I don't remember. What do Jews do when you get a decision like that? They fought. And one group said there were these 3 women, the Henrique's daughters, and their father had been a Kohen. And he had no sons, 3 daughters. So the 3 daughters wanted to be Kohens. And there were people that wanted to support them and people that didn't. And what we did in practice, it depended on the week. It depended what I could get away with.
You should run for president.
You think? That sounds like a great job. Riva.
Yeah, I was just amused at the idea that we're grandfathering in women.
Ironic.
Grandmothering in women, yes. But it's not just right now it's just a symbolic thing that maybe Riva could get an aliyah as the first aliyah instead of the third. But if the temple's rebuilt, Riva could get a great job in Israel as a working in the temple, whereas now she can't. So it potentially has economic implications for people who might be able to claim such status. So, what can I say? It's a rituals complex thing. But getting back to the idea of God, if the original idea of God was a very large, very macho man, like Zeus almost, with a beard and with big muscles and with a little bit of a quick temper, then the idea of animal sacrifices, that you would burn some of the animal and the smell would go up to God and God would say, oh, those people remember me, what a nice smell, makes sense, right? Lorraine, can you accept this as making sense in that context?
No.
You can't accept that thousands of years ago that maybe Judaism was different than now and that they saw God in that way?
They might have seen him in that way, but I don't think he would see himself in that way.
Oh, okay. Well, that's another question. But if God is up there with a big nose waiting to smell something good, you better give him something good to smell, or else he's going to get mad.
Maybe.
That's not your conception of God.
No.
Okay, and that's good, because if you had that primitive conception of God, we'd say that Lorraine's conception of God is very primitive, and that wouldn't be a compliment. So it's good that you see God in more, abstract terms. It's, we see that as a big advance. But we're trying now to figure out what was the original thinking. And you wouldn't have sacrifices with the smells going up if God is abstract. It wouldn't make sense, as Lorraine is saying. So, all right. Pam, Riva, B, comment, Pam. Pam and then Bernie.
Let me go ahead, read.
Oh, okay. Bernie, did you have a comment first?
Yeah, with regard to the sacrifices, when the animals were killed and burned or whatever, didn't they get eaten afterwards?
Yes, some of it gets burned, and some of it got taken by the Kohanim, and some of it was given back to the person off bringing the sacrifice.
So it really wasn't that cruel a thing to the animals.
Well, the animals being...
I mean, any more than killing it without sacrifice.
Right. I don't think the animal was happy either way.
Right.
Of course. But yeah, they didn't burn up all the animal. Now, it depends what kind of sacrifice. As we said, there are several different types of sacrifices. We could go through them on another occasion, and each one had a different recipe, if you will. And but in many of them, the bulk of the meat was handed back to the person bringing the sacrifice. Hands, Evelyn.
The fact that the Kohanim benefited from many of these rituals, were they instrumental in possibly promulgating many of these rituals to their own advantage so that they benefited from it? I'm being cynical, but hey, maybe it's true.
Evelyn, I can't believe that you would cast aspersions on my sincerity.
I'm talking about the ancient ones, not the current ones.
Those are my ancestors. How do you think we got so much Bitcoin collected? We collected all that sacrificial meat and we resold it. Of course, Evelyn's point is correct that there is religion is always involved with economics, right? You always need money to run a religion. And indeed, you could argue that one of the purposes of religion is to raise money. So the Kohanim are benefiting from this system, of course. And so the destruction of the Second Temple was a terrible, terrible blow, not to the whole Jewish people, you could say, but the Kohanim and the Leviim are the ones who lost their jobs as a result. So after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, the importance, the influence of the Kohanim and the Leviim went way down, and the influence of the rabbis went way up. And that's, yeah. And partly it's because the Kohanim no longer had a source of income. They had to get jobs. My father had to work as a dentist. Do you think he wanted to do that? He wanted to be in the temple, sitting around getting meat. But that option was not available. Okay, Pam, back to you. Before I self-incriminate.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Most of the book describes in detail how the korbanot or sacrifices of the people of Israel were to be offered in the ancient sanctuary. While the description seems to be applicable to the time when Moses and the people were still wandering through the desert, many modern scholars believe that this book was written by priests for the priests who presided over the sacrifices offered at the Jerusalem temple.
Ignore that paragraph.
Okay, putting an X to it right now. In our modern society, the idea of sacrificing animals, of extracting their blood, spilling it on the side of the altar, of cutting out various organs and arranging them for burning is both foreign and unpleasant. Some would describe it as disgusting and repugnant. Others would call it cruelty to animals, protesting it as morally offensive. Skip the,
No, I think we have to read that. This is, the box is from Sirach.
okay,
And this is a very important part of the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha, these are books that are not in the Hebrew Bible, but they're Jewish books. And they were largely ignored and maybe even lost for thousands of years. And Sirach is one of the most important of them. So it's a very interesting source that would not have been familiar to most Jews, even rabbinic Jews, even scholarly Jews, after the destruction of the temple and before the 1900s. I don't think Maimonides was aware of the existence of the book.
okay, I will read that one then. Beauty of the sacrifice. The author of Sirach, a book of the
Apocrypha.
Apocrypha, provides the following description of the sacrifice service in the Jerusalem temple. How glorious he, Simon the high priest, was when people gathered around him as he came out of the inner sanctuary, when he put on his glorious robe and clothed himself with superb perfection and went up to the holy altar, when he received the portions from the hands of the priests, as he stood by the hearth of the altar with a garland of brethren around him, with the Lord's offering in their hands before the congregation of Israel, finishing the service at the altars and arranging the offering to the Most High, the Almighty. He reached out his hand to the cup and poured a libation of the blood of the grape. He poured it out at the foot of the altar as a pleasing odor to the Most High, the King of all.
Okay, so here we have a description of what the high priest did. Simon, it is possible that this is around the time that Simon, as the high priest, got into a fight with some of the other priests, and they ran away to Qumran, and that's the origin of the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll people, possibly. But anyway, so you have here Simon. What is he doing? Who can describe in their own words what is this ritual? What is this ritual? Describe it a little bit, Marcia.
To me, it's a show. I mean, he is putting on some sort of a demonstration of how, how, I don't know how even how I'm losing words. It's just, to me, look at me, I'm the leader and I'm glorious and I have all these wonderful robes and I'm, it just, to me, a show.
What did we used to wear in our synagogue on Friday nights before it came? That the cantor and rabbi would wear?
You mean the
Robes.
colleges?
Right. And what do we still,
robes. Yeah.
and what do we still wear on the high holy days?
A robe, yeah.
And where do we get this idea from?
From the early temple.
Yes, so we're still in our synagogue to some degree copying in Marcia's words, the show of the temple. And you could say the rabbi and the cantor are basically putting on a similar show. And at the end of services every Friday night, we do a prayer right before we eat the oneg, which is called the Kiddush.
The priestly blessing, you mean?
And we do the blessing over
Yeah, the blessing.
Over the bread and the wine.
And what's in the cup?
Wine,
Wine.
What do they have
Libation,
here?
right?
grape juice.
The libation of the blood of the grape. Except
Right.
here, what does he do with the grape juice or the wine?
He
Pours it out.
pours it out.
Okay, on the foot of the altar. So maybe Friday night I should just pour the wine on the carpet.
You'll only make a mess.
In front of
And who's gonna clean it up?
I'll pour the wine on the carpet in front of the ark. The chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, whose wife I believe is
Gonna be
here,
happy.
is going to send me a very aggressive email saying, "Rabbi, what did you do?" I
You
said,
betcha.
I'm doing exactly what Simon the high priest did. He
Yeah.
said they had stones down there. We have carpeting.
A waste of Manischewitz, right?
And he came out. So this is part of the sacrifice service. So it's not just about sacrificing the animal. There is a part of it where the high priest kind of, does something to show the people what's being done. And there's a ceremony with the wine, and then at the end, what has Sarah said? The purpose of pouring out the wine is so that who can do what?
So God can smell it all the way up there.
Right. So God likes the smell of good French wine. Steve.
Reva had her hand up.
Sorry, Reva. Where's
thank you.
Reva's box moved.
I'm so sorry. I thought it was very interesting that they're shifting from blood represented by wine. And obviously, to this day, we still use wine in so many of our programs, activities, ceremonies.
And people ask me all the time, why wine? And the standard answer is it was just the most luxurious liquid, and you want to bless the Shabbat over a good, something that's considered fine. But obviously, there's more to it, as you see here. Marcia.
I want to go back. The wording on this makes it into a show. When you think about it, we all wear something to signify. Men wear suits when they go to work. Women wear dresses, and there's wedding dresses, and there's this dress for in the Christian religions for first communions and this and that. So clothing is oftentimes an indicator of status, of occasion, etc. So, but I think in this particular Apocrypha description, I find it making it into more of a show because of the wording, how glorious, etc. That it maybe it wasn't that dramatic a situation. It just was what you wore that day, on those occasions. You know what I'm saying?
So it wasn't such a big deal.
Maybe
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
Hands, please, hands. Evelyn.
Well, I don't completely agree with Marcia in that there are descriptions of the priests and the raiment that they wore. They were supposed to have worn blue in specific context because the blue, which was made from the mollusk of a specific clam, was a very rare commodity. That's where the word royal purple comes from, because depending upon the pH of the extract, you get blue or purple or red or whatever it was. But there were books that described the priests and their clothing that was specific for these particular occasions. And yes, it was a big to-do. They made a big tzimmus out of it, shall we say. And it was for show, but it also designated a particular occasion. Just as Marcia says, we dress up for weddings and bar mitzvahs and what have you, to show that this occasion is special. So therefore, the priest's raiment was meant to indicate that this was a special occasion and therefore was worthy of being written down and remembered as such.
Okay. Back to you, Pam.
Okay. In the ancient society, however, sacrifices and offerings to God were considered not only appropriate, but necessary expressions of faith. The word korban, or sacrifice, literally means draw near and reveals the purpose of the temple offerings. They were meant to unite the worshiper with God. By offering sacrifices, a person says thanks to God and sought forgiveness for sins. The drama and the beauty of the sacrificial service, along with the music, prayers, strong odors of incense, created an atmosphere of awe. In presenting a sacrifice, one was giving something important of oneself to God. For the ancients, the smoke of a burning sacrifice on the altar was proof of a person's love and reverence for God and for God's commandments.
Yeah, but what Harvey Fields doesn't say is that the ancients believed that God wanted to smell this stuff, that it wasn't just doing something to prove your love for God. I mean, what's the point of doing something to prove your love to God that takes so much energy and kills a cow if God is completely apathetic to it? The whole point was that God wants this and God likes this because God knows a lot of what are the nerves in the nose,
Olfactory.
olfactory glands, right?
Nerves.
God
Nerves.
has their olfactory nerves,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
not olfactory glands. But anyway, God has a very sensitive nose, and God likes to smell barbecue. And that's why God spends a lot of time in Kansas City.
Good beef.
That's a shout out to Steve. Okay, remember, raise your hands, please, Donna. Otherwise, I'm going to be in big trouble. Donna.
No, I've eaten Kansas City beef. It's delicious.
I don't think God wants to eat it. I think he just wants to smell it.
I know. Well, you know, God is God, and God can do anything with or without anything. He's God.
But remember, Donna, when we're talking about God, there's different concepts of God depending on what text, I'm making a very crass distinction between what ancients 3,000 years ago thought and what Maimonides thought 1,000 years ago, as just an example. So.
I know, but isn't it possible that God can smell the odors without having a big nose? He doesn't need a nose to smell. He's God.
and that's probably what developed a little bit later. So I think I'm just guessing that maybe early in the process, the ancients envisioned God as having a very sensitive nose. Later, they might say, well, God can still smell it, but God doesn't have a body at all. Anything is possible. But at least according to what I'm reading now, the book suggests that originally or early, at least some of the early Israelites felt that God actually had a sensitive nose. And that nose is a very, as with the feet and with the head and with his chest, all of the body parts were considered very real. And this is revolutionary to me because I had no idea this, even though I should have. And so that's why I'm stressing it to you, because how shocked I am to realize this. Okay, back to you, Pam.
Okay. Those who misused the ritual sacrifices, however, were severely criticized. When the prophet Isaiah, for example, saw people ignore the poor and the sick, cheat and deal dishonestly with another, but take their offerings to the Jerusalem temple, he scorned and denounced them. He told them God did not want their sacrifices because their hands were stained with crime. Among ancient Jews, hypocrisy was ridiculed. Sacrifices were not considered a means of removing guilt for wrongdoing.
But Harvey Fields is mixing different periods here. I would say if we're talking about the prophets came later, and Isaiah is attacking the earlier attitude, whereas Harvey Fields is mixing it together. So I think Harvey is a little bit historically ignorant here. So I think that Isaiah is coming along, he's saying, hold on. Just because God may enjoy the sacrifices, this is not going to be sufficient if you're mistreating people here on earth. But I think originally the God was seen more almost like a Greek God, and that you just had to keep God happy, and that didn't necessarily require you to behave properly to people around you. So I think Isaiah is changing the religion a little bit, or expanding it, making it more ethically sensitive. Riva and then Bernie.
Yeah, I think two things are going on here. One is the gradual shift over time from seeing a very anthropomorphic version of God, a very human type God, to something more abstract. And that happens a great deal over time of the Jewish religion. But the second thing is a focus shifting from pleasing God or your interaction with God directly, and shifting more towards your behavior to other people.
Correct. And the prophets, as you know, are very concerned with the latter, with behavior toward other people. And I'm not sure that originally religion focused so much on that. Riva, do you want to add anything?
No, you covered it.
Okay, Bernie.
Things. One is that this paragraph would make for a good Yom Kippur sermon. And the other is I'm curious how contemporaneous idol worshippers viewed their God as anthropomorphic or not.
What, say that sentence again?
How the contemporaneous idol worshippers viewed their gods. Did they view them as having human characteristics, or were they just a rock or whatever?
Well, it depends what kind of idol worshippers or what period you're talking about. But the Greeks, I think we're all familiar with Greek mythology. The Greek gods, had personalities and had very extreme character traits, positive and negative, and had likes and dislikes.
I'm talking more about the time frame we're talking about here.
The earlier period, it's hard to know. There was Baal, there was Asherah, I'm not sure, And of course, that's really important because early Judaism is clearly a response to or a polemic against early idolatry. And so if we don't know enough about that, and Cy Perlis is not here, but Cy, constantly reminds me, you got to put it in historical context, and that's not so easy to do. Several times I've looked for a easy to read book that would explain the early idolatry system, and it's not easy to find such a book. If anyone can find something good, let me know. I saw a hand. Yes, B.
Well, when looking at this paragraph, it seems to me that it is a bridge from ancient Judaism towards creating a modern Judaism, where you can't expiate your guilt by giving a sacrifice to God.
Right.
And it changes then to making it right with other people. We're not up to that yet. But this is really a critical portion, because it is saying that we have to change.
Right. And the prophets, the prophetic period is clearly the time in which that change occurs. And the prophets really stress that you have to first be nice to other people, or else all the ritual you do doesn't matter. And that's incorporated then into Talmudic literature. So the box right there is just two quotes from different parts of rabbinic literature that basically say the same thing, that say you can't just offer a sacrifice and then you're done. You got to be nice to people. So, all right, but we'll read it anyway. They're short. Pam, you're willing to read it?
Yes. Before I read, though, I just want to remind you, Rabbi, that if you use this Parsha next high holidays, Bernie has to get credit.
I mean, I used to be very careful in my sermons to acknowledge sources, because obviously, I mean, I write original material, but I also, will use other people's. So I would say, like Rabbi Harold Kushner, wrote the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good Things, he said. But then I realized nobody cares where I get these sources from. So then, and they just they add time, and they make the sermon, it makes it more tiring. So then I just dropped all my references. So I'll just say stuff. Some of it's my idea, some of it's not. And I guess if somebody really was interested, they could ask me, and I'd say, oh, that particular thought comes from so-and-so. So if I plagiarized Bernie, you know, I guess he could sue, and then my my lawyer will have to deal with his lawyer.
Well, you got 12 witnesses here, so you're. Anyway, I will read the box. Acceptable sacrifices. Let no person say, I will go and do ugly and immoral things. Then I will bring a bull with much meat and offer it as a sacrifice on the altar. God will not have mercy on such a person. But I'm sorry.
Well, and that's pretty clear, right? You have to, your ethical behavior to people has to be consistent with your ritual commitment.
Let a person do good deeds, study Torah, and bring an offering. Then God will have mercy and extend repentance. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70 CE, Jews faced the question, what shall be done with the institution of sacrifices? The rabbis determined that since sacrifices were to be offered only at the Jerusalem temple, Jews would need to wait until the temple was rebuilt before reintroducing them. Thus, the reintroduction of animal sacrifices and offerings is unlikely.
All right, so the Samaritans had their temple in Mount Gerizim, and that was destroyed, but they kept offering sacrifices anyway on the hill there. So there were alternatives, and there were Jewish temple sites before Jerusalem became the only one. So the rabbis could have said, well, we don't have a temple for the moment, so we're going to allow sacrifices at the following 5 locations. They could have said that. Or they could have said, we're going to keep offering sacrifices on the Temple Mount, even though there's no temple there anymore. I don't know if the Romans wouldn't have allowed that. And probably the Romans wouldn't have allowed sacrifices anywhere else either, and that may have played a role in this decision. Most Jews thought the temple had been destroyed before. They thought this was just temporary, that there'll be a new temple in a few years and everything will go back to normal. It was only 100 years later or so that people began to realize, hey, the temple's not coming back. So it was a gradual process. If our temple would burn down, God forbid, we would wait for the insurance money and then we'd rebuild a new temple. Different one, but we'd rebuild. But or we'd buy something that was already built, but there'd be something within 3 years, there'd be a new building. But that didn't happen in this case. But it took Jews at the time a long time to realize that this was a permanent thing. And it was bad luck. If Julian the Apostate had lived, there was one Roman emperor who rejected Christianity. And and if he had lived, then probably things would have gone better for Judaism. And also, if the Torah had not been translated into Greek, what we call the Septuagint, this allowed for the rapid spread of Christianity, even though it was a Jewish translation for Jews originally. So we got a lot of bad breaks. If any of these things had happened differently, then the temple might have been rebuilt and Judaism might have done much better than it did. But, we had bad breaks. Okay, back to you, Pam.
I'll pass along the baton.
Okay. Minya, are you interested?
Yes, yes, I will.
We're in the top of page 100, right-hand column at the top.
Even before the last sacrifices were being offered in the temple, prayer was already on the way to replacing sacrifice as the most acceptable means of worship for Jews. With the introduction of the synagogue in the 3rd century BCE, words of prayer by both individuals and congregations often replaced journeying to Jerusalem. By the time the temple was destroyed, there were many thousands of synagogues throughout the land of Israel, with 480 in Jerusalem alone. Many of the prayers that form the basis of Jewish prayer books today were created long before the offering of sacrifices at the temple ceased. After the temple was destroyed, the rabbis included prayers for its revival in the ritual of the synagogue. For example, the traditional version of the Avodah prayer of the Amidah includes, restore the worship, sacrificial service of your temple, and receive in love and favor the offerings and the prayers of Israel. Recalling the additional sacrifices offered on Sabbath and festivals, the rabbis added a special service called Musaf, meaning additional service, to the Sabbath and festival celebrations of the synagogue as a way of praying for the day when the temple would be rebuilt and the sacrifices of animals reintroduced.
And Reform Judaism never included a Musaf service in our prayer books because we didn't want to, to go back to the animal sacrificial system, and also because the point of the prayers was not to, mimic what happened in the temple, but rather to pray. And it was felt that praying once, was enough, and to do a second service right after the first service, didn't seem to be something that would work towards creating the right atmosphere with people. And you could see if on Friday night I said, tonight we're going to do the prayers, then we're going to do them a second time. I think you'd be pretty obvious what the response might be from most of the congregation. Comments about this is a very interesting paragraph. Steve, Shirley, Evelyn.
The Musaf service is on Saturday services, not Friday night, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
So, and in which case then Friday night, it's a moot point. I mean, it's, we wouldn't be doing it anyway.
All right, I moved it for rhetorical purposes. Shirley, is that a hand?
Yeah. Here in Mobile, before you became our rabbi, that Rabbi Kunstad was the rabbi for like 25 or 28 years. And he said over the years, it really shocked him that these groups would come to take a tour of the temple. And invariably, somebody from the group would ask him, where do you do your sacrifices? And he said it was just over and over and over. They asked, where did you do your sacrifice? Which is interesting that people think that we still do them.
What did they think we were sacrificing?
Children.
Probably.
Or look for the horns.
But if you're a Christian and you study the Bible, the quote unquote Old Testament, you're going to see the sacrificial system there. And if you don't know anything about post-biblical Judaism, you're not aware that the system stopped because of destruction, Second Temple. And when you hear you're going to visit a temple, you figure Jewish temples have sacrifices. It's a pretty logical thing to think. Other comments? Lorraine? Pam?
We do sacrifices now. It's a monetary sacrifice. Religious organization, but we do sacrifices.
Well, that's what I said at the outset, that the sacrifice was a monetary consideration as opposed to a something from your soul. Like,
all right, I'm trying to promote this idea of restoring animal sacrifices, but nobody here is particularly enthusiastic about that. And once I tell you, you're still going to have to make just as much financial donations or more, then it's going to completely destroy any interest. Okay, Marcia, comment, and then B, and then Marcia.
No,
and
Steve also has a comment.
Steve.
That's what I'm going to say. Yeah, I disagree with Bernie's.
Okay, Marcia, then Steve.
I'll be fast. I disagree with Bernie's thing about high holidays because we don't want to limit we want that donation on on Yom Kippur. We ask for the sacrifice of the monetary donation. So that's, that we don't want to just do the prayer part of it and doing good thing, So we have to have, you always have the high holiday pledges going on at Yom Kippur.
You don't want to bring a pig.
No pigs.
No pigs.
Quick question, Rabbi. If the Orthodox had their would they consider bringing back animal sacrifices?
Yes, it's in the halacha.
But it's not being done today.
It's not being done today, partly because the mosques are up there, partly because some Orthodox Jews believe that the God has to send a signal that it's okay to set it up again, probably send somebody who's a Messiah. The thing is, the Messiah is not a superhuman person. It's really a descendant of the previous kings who's going to become the next king. And the way you know he's the Messiah is that he's successful. So it's not like there's going to be necessarily a voice from heaven. So how do you know the Messiah is, entitled to rebuild the temple? Is that he successfully rebuilds the temple. So, but I think if the mosques weren't up there, a lot of Israeli Orthodox Jews would be clamoring to rebuild it. Of course, I would think. And I do have my friend, the Orthodox Jew, Philip, who will speak to us sometime. We can arrange that. We have to call him and kind of drag him out of his activities. But these are questions you want to keep a list of questions to ask our Orthodox speaker.
Oh, yeah, right, bye.
Okay, Minya.
I may be looking at this from a practical point of view, but if sacrifices were to come back, doesn't it involve all kinds of location? Where could you do this? Do you have to have special building set aside?
Yeah,
so
the temple.
But then you're dealing with having a special altar?
Yeah. I mean, that's what this yeshiva in Jerusalem, Ateret Kohanim, they've been studying, is if they were allowed to rebuild a temple, if the two mosques were moved or disappeared, what would they do? And so they study what are the dimensions of temple? What is the architecture of temple? How would it be built? What are the materials? What is the altar? What is the parochet, the curtain? What are the chairs? What is a shewbread? Every little thing in terms of the construction of the building, the construction of the equipment, the eligibility of the animals. How do you vet the Kohanim? That's what they're all working on. So they know exactly what to do. They know the problems that might be, that certain materials are not clear what it is, and what are they going to do about that. So there's a lot of, so all that is being discussed. Minya, back to you for follow-up.
So if you look at the picture on page 98, that altar where they're doing the sacrifice, that's inside the temple.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's inside the temple. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that picture is accurate.
Well, it just gives you an idea.
No, it can't be. It can't be. If the sacrificial smoke is supposed to ascend to the nose of God, then it would have to be outside. It couldn't possibly be confined to the inside of a building. That's one inaccuracy. The other is what Rabbi was talking about, these people getting ready for the possibility of sacrifice. Do you have any idea what the animal rights movement today would do to any particular concept? The concept of sacrificing animals is an anachronistic one. It existed then, it cannot exist today because today's values are so radically different from what was then before that this is a concept you might as well just get rid of. Don't think about
But
it.
Evelyn, a lot of these same people are trying right now, and I'm planning to do my sermon Friday on this. They're trying to do away with judicial oversight of the legislature in Israel. So these people don't think the way you think. They want a king. They don't want a Supreme Court. They don't even want a parliament. They think they should be in control and they should be making all the rules for everybody there. So these are not people who think in a modern way at all, like zero. So, and so that also gives you a little perspective why they're not worried about judicial oversight, that they feel it's perfectly fine for the Knesset if they can put together a coalition of 61 to then appoint all the judges, because to them that just takes away one barrier to implementing their program. They're not interested in checks and balances. Donna, and then Pam, and then Marcia, and then if Minya wants to say anything. Donna.
Two things. They already have everything ready to go into the temple. Everything is made. You can go through it and see it in Jerusalem, but everything is there. All they have to do is build the temple and move in. The second thing, the second thing is, all meat, Jewish meat, whether I guess it's here in the United States, but in Israel, is killed according to the kosher style. Does that come out of the sacrificial killing of the animals? Is there any relationship or anything?
I don't know. I'm sure there's some relationship, but the two are distinct things. So shechting an animal, in the halacha there's a whole, the knife has to be sharp. Where do you cut? How do you do that? I know much less about how you would prepare a sacrifice. I would imagine there's some similarities, but it's not the same. But I would imagine that it's probably not that different. But I can't answer. That's a great question, but I don't know. We could probably look it up if you're that interested. Pam, and then Marcia, and then Minya.
Rabbi, is the government in Israel smart enough not to mess with the Temple Mount and not try to squeeze in some temple next to the mosques? And
I haven't heard, until Donna said that, I hadn't heard that idea, but there's a lot of pressure on the governments, not just this government, to allow people up there to pray, which seems a reasonable thing, that this is our holy temple, we should be able to pray there. The problem is that the Muslims are very zealous, and they view that as they know that if Jews start praying there, Jews are going to want to pray there more, and then
take over.
It has its very sensitive thing, but yeah, there's a lot of pressure on various governments to allow more access to the Temple Mount. Because that's really the holy site, not the Western Wall. The Western Wall's nothing.
Yeah.
It just became a holy site.
Government has to be careful, because it's just not worth the chaos that it would create.
Right. No, not worth it at all. Yeah. But logically, it's hard to say to, Israeli Jews that can't pray on the site of their holy temple. That's one of the main purposes of coming back to Israel, is to be able to rebuild. I mean, the prayers all say that, may we rebuild our temple, and may we be able to pray to God from the temple. So there's a very strong case to allow it. It just politically doesn't, as you say, is not going to be good. Who was next is Marcia, Minya, Steve.
Okay, so quickly, We shouldn't look that askance at what's going on in Israel, but surely our Supreme Court has been dictated by politics over the years. And even now, there's a lot of question as to, the veracity or the independence of the court from politics,
Hi, right. And it's a little bit frightening to see parallel things happening in America and Israel and other countries, that are just seem to be contrary to our sense of, the way I was raised is that you want two strong political parties that are roughly equal in strength and can serve as balances to get, to each other. And that the two parties are supposed to each work with each other to effect a compromise to make sure things stay in the middle. And instead, we now have the two parties pushing out all the people that would work with the other side, and each side is more and more and more extreme, and to the point of being crazy with the things they say don't make any sense. So you have two extremists, two groups of extremists. And in Israel, you see a little bit of the same thing, at least on one side.
Yeah, and you want the judicial to be independent of the legislative, and that's what the major problem is.
But as you point out, our country doesn't have a perfect system either. But at least we have a constitution. Israel has no constitution, which makes what's going on there particularly dangerous.
They don't have a.
Minya and then Steve.
I don't have a question.
I'm good.
Okay. Minya, back to you.
In his time, poet-philosopher Yehuda Halevi dreamed of the day when he would awaken in Jerusalem and experience the Levite song and sacrificial service. Later, Zionist Rabbi Zvi Hirsch Kalischer predicted that the Jewish people would be gathered from the four corners of the earth to the land of Israel, rebuild the temple, and offer sacrifices upon the altar of God. In her commentary, modern interpreter Nahama Leibowitz explains that the sacrifices are a positive means of promoting communion with the divine, and a symbol and expression of a person's desire to purify himself and become reconciled with God. Despite the fact that rabbis and Jewish interpreters honored the tradition of temple sacrifices, even praying for their reintroduction, many believed prayer was superior to sacrifice as a form of worship. They argued that while the temple offerings depended upon a particular place and altar, prayer could be offered anywhere and any time. Prayer consisted of the quiet meditations of the heart or words of the mouth expressed in a whisper, a song, or simply spoken. Prayer, the rabbis say, is greater than all the sacrifices. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, I want to get to Maimonides.
Okay. It is reported that the leader of the Jewish people at the time of the destruction of the temple actually counseled his students by telling them not to mourn the fact that they could no longer offer sacrifices. Standing in the ruins of the temple, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai told his students, "Do not grieve. We have a means of atonement that is equal to sacrifice. It is the doing of kind deeds, where God teaches us, I desire mercy, not sacrifices."
And Yochanan ben Zakkai was the guy that got smuggled out of Jerusalem by pretending to die.
Wow. Citing the virtues of prayer as opposed to sacrifices, other rabbis also claimed that prayer was superior. The people of Israel say, "We are poor and have no sacrifices to bring for offering." God tells them, "I need only words." Furthermore, say the rabbis, even if they complain that they have no synagogue in their city, God tells them to pray in their fields, and if not there, on their beds, and if not on their beds, then in their hearts. The point is clear. Unlike sacrifices, which depend on an altar, an animal, or a gift, prayer is dependent only upon the hopes and honesty of one's heart. What is prayer? Prayer is the heart of significant living. Prayer is a step on which we rise from the self we are to the self we wish to be. Prayer affirms the hope that no reality can crush the aspiration that can never acknowledge defeat. Prayer seeks the power to do wisely, to act generously, to live helpfully. Prayer is the search for silence amidst noise. Prayer takes us beyond the self. Our prayers are answered when we are challenged to be what we can be. So we're here at Maimonides. In his famous book, Guide for the Perplexed, Moses Maimonides argues that sacrifices were an early form of worship given to the Jewish people so that they could learn how to serve God without feeling different from all other people surrounding them. Slowly, Maimonides says, the people learned that the sacrificial service is not the primary objective of the commandments, but that prayer is a better means of obtaining nearness to God. Agreeing with the early rabbis, Maimonides emphasizes that superiority of prayer is that it can be offered everywhere and by every person.
Okay, stop there. So I'm skipping over the paragraphs dealing with prayer. Harvey Fields wanted to put that into this parsha, but I think it's a separate discussion, so we've avoided talking about that. But here Maimonides is saying, what about the sacrifices? I mean, it's really kind of a very controversial interpretation going back 800 or 900 years. Anybody can explain it? Evelyn?
It seems self-evident. I mean, he says that they sacrificed because this was typical of all of the peoples in that area. And so they went go with the flow, as the saying goes. But as time went by and values changed, and they felt that prayer would be an acceptable form to differentiate itself from sacrifice. In other words, you don't have to have sacrifice in order to commune with God. Your prayer, your words, your thoughts would be equally as acceptable. And I think in today's modern world, we tend to think along those lines much more than the actual need for a physical sacrifice.
Now, what Harvey Fields doesn't say here is that in the Mishnah, Maimonides had two important books, Mishnah Torah, which is a summary of all of the mitzvot in the Talmud, and the Guide for the Perplexed, which was his philosophic, theological book. And in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides says, when the Messiah comes, we're going to rebuild the temple, we're going to restart sacrifices. Here's the different sacrifices, here how it works. In the Guide for the Perplexed, however, he says, we only ever had sacrifices because we had to, because the people at the time, the Israelites, were conditioned from seeing the idolaters around them, and it was necessary. And the whole goal of it was not to have the sacrifices, but to actually get rid of the sacrifices. But yet you started with what, as Evelyn said, what people are familiar with. And the goal was to wean them off of this stupidity and move them to a higher plane, but slowly, so it wouldn't freak them out. So how does Maimonides, the same author, say such contrary things? It was so contrary that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was a famous a rabbi in Europe about 250 years ago, he said that the Guide for the Perplexed could not have been written by Maimonides, because how can you have one author saying two such contrary things? The answer, of course, is Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed says, I'm going to deliberately contradict myself as often as I can. And if you're an astute reader, then you'll be able to figure out what I really mean. And Misha Yavin Yavin, whoever will understand will understand. Now, this was in a time when Maimonides had no control who might read his books, and he was afraid of freaking people out. So he would say things that were quote unquote more orthodox, and secretly he said stuff that were more modern. And he was hoping that the wrong people would not understand the wrong thing. Pam, you're smiling.
I'm
He's
just,
obfuscating the issue.
after hearing this, I'm wondering why he's your favorite.
No, but he was a product of his time. I mean, if he was afraid to say what he thought, he was trying to.
Well, and why was he afraid to say what he thought? Because he was afraid that most Jews at the time, you're under tremendous pressure from the Christian or the Muslim majorities, and that most of the people, the Jews at the time, very poorly educated and very under a lot of pressure. You don't want to freak them out, because if you break them of some of their long-held myths, they're liable to just convert out of the religion, because they, so you have to reinforce their existing beliefs in order to keep them loyal. You can't, with us, we can play around more with, well, we no longer believe in that, and I can shock you, and you're not going to go anywhere. But Maimonides was afraid that the average Jew at his time would freak out and go somewhere. So he's talking to just a small group of intellectuals, but he has to get that message across in writing without making it clear to the average person. So he uses a lot of contradictions and wink, wink.
So how do you do it? How do you interpret the title of this book, Guide to the Perplexed?
Oh.
Because he's perplexing people even more.
Well, that's kind of the goal. So he's saying that for people who are perplexed, read my book. And if you read it carefully, you'll be able to come up with my esoteric doctrines that will help you become less perplexed. If you just read it on the surface, then you'll become more perplexed. So you have to, but I did this as well a little bit in a few of my books, where I kind of secretly hid my real views. Yes, Riva.
Yeah, I think the final paragraph really clarifies a lot of this issue and is actually a very nice summary of what we've been talking about.
Who'd like to read that?
Let Riva read it.
I'll read it. In his study of prayer, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel suggests that prayer is not a substitute for sacrifice. Prayer is sacrifice. By that observation, Heschel means that in true prayer, we try to surrender our vanities, to burn our insolence, to abandon bias, dishonesty, and envy. Prayer is a means through which we sacrifice our selfishness and greed and get in touch with our powers for truth, mercy, and love. Amen.
Wow.
Well read.
Very nice. And so Riva, why does this speak to you in particular?
Because I think this really exemplifies that shift from focusing on our interactions with God directly, with rather shifting to interactions with our relationships with other people and how we live our lives.
Very nice. Any final thoughts? And everybody knows who Abraham Joshua Heschel was, very, very famous American Jewish philosopher and activist, marched with Martin Luther King and wrote many books that are still considered to be classics. And you can see why. Okay, so we are planning a sacrifice but we don't have an altar, so we're going to do it in our parking lot next week. and we'll let you know the time and place.
Steve can do this barbecue.
I'll light the fire.
Okay.
Okay, back to you, Steve.
First of all, any announcements by anyone? Okay, we have the concert Sunday, and I know Passover's coming up. So if you have not made reservations, please do so. I know that Gloria Bold is working on this very diligently and wants to make sure that we have enough places and food for everyone. So please make reservations if you have not done so.
And this
Let's conclude then with the blessing.
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry, Marcia.
Sisterhood Seder is this coming Monday,
yes.
and the last chance this week, I guess, to make a reservation, okay?
And also scholar in residence, we have a professor from Indiana University coming in on the 13th and 14th of April. On the 14th, there's like a wine and cheese afternoon on Saturday afternoon. And she's going to talk about how to steal priceless French art.
Okay.
Now let us conclude with the blessing. Together, Baruch,
Torah emet.
Blessed is
Adonai our God,
ruler
Ruler of the universe, who has given us the teaching of truth, planting within us eternal life.
Blessed is
Adonai.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, everyone, have a good rest of the week and see you
See
soon.
you Friday.
Bye.
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 Have a good
Thanks,
one.
Rabbi. Well done.
Bye.